I want to talk a little bit about how this, actually the woke or critical social justice ideology, how that actually applies to sex and gender, because this is obviously one of your main topics. I mean, you've described to me previously, that there's basically kind of an advocacy for the abolition of legal sex. I think those are the words that you used. I mean, it sounds kind of insane.
Yeah, there's plenty of debate about the definitions here, but for the purposes of a conversation, let's say that sex applies to biological sex. Gender is an expression of that sex in society, and therefore is at least partially socially constructed. Although I would argue that even gender isn't wholly socially constructed. It's not arbitrary. There's a reason that most girls are feminine and most boys have masculine traits. There are biological and hormonal reasons for that. But yes, when I say the abolition of legal sex, I think that's exactly what's happening. There are two major pieces of legislation that, in my view, are attempts to abolish biological sex from the categories of male and female from the law. One is the Equality Act, which has been going through Congress, has passed the House, is now in negotiation in the Senate, let's say. And the other is the Equal Rights Amendment, which is an attempt to amend the Constitution to say that there shall be no discriminations on the basis of sex. Now, that sounds very nice in the way that we use the word discrimination in common parlance, which means, in some way unfair discrimination. But we discriminate on the basis of sex all the time in ways that I think people would be shocked if we stopped doing them, right? Doing it, rather. So for example, we discriminate on the basis of sex when we separate men's and women's prisons, when we don't put males and females into lockup together for obvious reasons. We discriminate on the basis of sex when we have male and female sports teams, right? This is the big transgender debate. But in some ways, both the Equality Act and the Equal Rights Amendment make the transgender accommodation debate moot because they explode the categories of sex altogether, right? It's easier to talk about what do we do with a tiny percentage of exceptions? What's the fairest way to deal with those exceptions, right? It's much more radical, in my view, to blow up those categories altogether and to pretend that, for example, sex is a spectrum, which it is not. Human species, as you know, as a biologist, is sexually dimorphic. A tiny percentage of genetic pathologies do not disprove that. For example, some people are born XXY, right, or YYX. There are some genetic maladies that create or appearance of having, for example, sex organs of both sexes and so on. That doesn't mean the human species is not sexually dimorphic. We're biologically male, biologically female, and yes, there are some very tiny percentage of exceptions that are. I'm not speaking in the derogative sense here. They're pathologies in the medical sense, right? They're abnormal genetic mutations. And to not recognize that, I can't think of anything in some sense more radical. Critical race theory, in some way, I understand, right? Because even though I think it's damaging and pernicious and all the things that we just talked about, we talked about Frederick Douglass. He started with the position, I think, essentially, the underlying position of critical race theory, which is that the systems of this country, its constitution, its declaration, are what are oppressing me. And unlike today's, I think, unlike today's minorities, he could have an indisputable claim to being oppressed. He was literally enslaved because of the color of his skin, right? And forbidden from learning to read or write or improve himself in any way. But he moved on from that position the more he learned about our system. But I can understand the impulse, right? We aren't so many generations removed from, for example, Jim Crow, right? I can understand the impulse to say, this country, I guess Langston Hughes said it best, right? It was never America for me. I think that's a Langston Hughes poem. It was never America for me. I understand this impulse. I think it's ultimately destructive. But it makes more sense to me than the idea that biological sex is not real, right? This is, to me, something that I can't believe we're debating. It's so obvious that not only are men and women biologically different in the sense that men are stronger and faster, and this makes women vulnerable in certain situations, like prison, but also that our brains are different. There's a ton of social science and science neurobiological research that shows that men and women are quite different. And those differences start in the womb. Like, there was a study, I think, in 2017 that showed that you can, with like 96% accuracy or something, determine on a 6-month-old fetus by a brain scan whether that fetus is male or female. Right? That's not social construction. That's not taught to us by, evil sexist patriarchs. That doesn't mean that women are lesser, they're dumber or incapable or anything like that. But it means that we are different, and we should expect, ultimately, that men and women in a free society will make different choices about, for example, life, career, interpersonal relationships, that they'll behave differently, that it's appropriate for them to, on average, behave differently. You don't have to be deterministic about any individual to say that, yeah, I think society should treat men and women differently in certain circumstances where those differences are relevant. And most certainly, the law should recognize when men and women are different and those differences are relevant, like on sports teams or in prison, or any situation in which those very real biological differences become relevant. Now, they're not relevant in all situations. It's not relevant to who can become a chemist, for example. But there are many situations in which they're relevant, and it seems to me to be anti-reality to pretend that that's not the case, and it has really terrible consequences for girls and women.
So it is actually pretty amazing when you think about it. I think, the vast majority of people, basically looking at reality, so to speak, not even a party to some of these studies, like that's a fascinating study about the brain scans, for example, would understand that humans are sexually dimorphic, right, fundamentally. Now, but this is being discussed at the highest intellectual and policy-making levels of the country as if it was not true. And how does that happen?
I think it happens for the same reason. People are afraid to say something that is, as you say, patently obvious, to the point where we see a lot of parents feeling they have to shut up, for example, about their daughters running track against biological men, right? And losing out on scholarships because of that. Or, it was just, the data was just released that, or there was a leak, basically, because they tried to hide this from the press. But in Washington State, in Oregon, they are putting men into women's prisons when they claim to identify as female. And that has already, in Washington State, resulted in at least one sexual assault in a prison by a sex offender who claimed to be female, was put in with women, and then committed an assault.
It's like a license for sexual predators, basically.
Yeah, and it's foolish to imagine that these laws won't be taken advantage of, by the way, by sexual predators, by other folks who are looking to exploit any kind of advantage, whether that's actual predation or just the opportunities and scholarships and so on.
It's kind of unbelievable.
It sounds crazy. It is crazy. It is patently obvious that men and women are different. And actually, I worry, beyond the issue itself, which I think is really important, I worry that it's training us to be silent about things that are obvious, right? To cultivate a kind of like public and private self, like, oh yes, in your own mind, this is crazy. It is crazy to send a man, a biological man, into the boxing ring with a biological woman. What that actually happened in MMA, and it ended up with the female fighter going to hospital with a broken skull. People know this is crazy, but they're afraid to say it. And I think that's almost more pernicious than any of the effects of the thing itself. Like, it's bad enough, but the worst thing is that it's training us not to say what's obvious.
Hey, thanks for watching American Thought Leaders. As you're probably well aware, big tech has been censoring a lot of content on its platforms, including some American Thought Leaders episodes, including some other Epoch Times content. Now, to deal with this, we've actually launched a new video platform, Epoch TV. Epoch TV is our premium platform for digital video content. It's got American Thought Leaders, it's got Facts Matter with Roman Balmakov, The Larry Elder Show, Crossroads with Joshua Phillip, and frankly, this is our contribution, if you will, to the uncensored media landscape, which is something we really, really need in this country and around the world, frankly. To subscribe, epochtv.com/ATL. Go to epochtv.com/ATL or hit the link below.